But at the same time, I think a lot of camping at that point is more going from one town to another, settling at a local campground for the night. It's not really a destination experience. But, of course, nowadays we have unbelievable popularity of the practice has only gained, I think, in the last few decades.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
It is a 60-degree day outside the NCPR studios as I record this, and that is why I am actually outside the NCPR studios. It's a little windy out here, maybe you can tell. Climate change aside, it's not going to be too long before being outside in the North Country is the rule rather than the exception. The annual flood of campers, tent campers, trailer campers, RV campers, people who just like sleeping on the ground, will start before you know it. I don't have any really good camping stories myself. My family camped our way across the country when I was 10 years old, and I remember basically two things from that trip. It rained almost every night, and on one of the rare nights when it didn't rain, an elk came along and ate my swimsuit that was hanging from the clothesline in our campsite. Whether you've done a lot or just a little bit of camping in your life, there are some things you probably take for granted. The map of the campground when you check in, the way the fire pit looks, the feel of your sleeping bag, and maybe you've never stopped to think about it, but all of those things, as well as everything else about camping, came as the result of some very deliberate planning and design. It turns out that those things, the planning and design, were pretty interesting too, at least as Martin Hogue tells it. Hogue is an architect and a professor of landscape architecture, and he describes his recent book as a visual history of camping's most essential items and activities. So I came back inside the studio to talk to him. Martin Hogue, welcome. Thank you so much for visiting with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You make the point when you wrap up this book that you do go camping, but you don't necessarily enjoy it all that much, which I can relate to. But reading this book, I can't help but get the sense that you really enjoy writing about camping. What makes the process of writing about it and the process of putting this particular book together so rewarding for you?
That's a great question. I mean, it's many of the colleagues that I've gotten to know over the years who have written about camping. I'm thinking about maybe Dan White and Terry Young, who have fantastic books on the history of camping, are themselves, I think, avid campers. And for me, it's really enjoying the kind of intellectual experience of, or what I think of as the disconnect between, I think, what I envision myself to be when I go camping and the kind of reality of it on the ground. And I think once I acknowledged that and I accepted that, I really started to rediscover that practice, but more in a historical way, really trying to understand from those early days in the Adirondacks to the present time, like how have we gone from, a very small group of usually men hiking in the woods of the Adirondacks in the late 19th century, building a camp from scratch to those large, very large campgrounds in state parks, national parks. And so that's been my own experience, has been to really understand that kind of transformation, that physical setting.
How does an architect and someone who specializes in landscape architecture get to be, I don't know whether you'd call yourself an expert, but certainly would you consider, in the history and maybe the aesthetics of camping?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there's something in camping, and I didn't understand that at first, but it really lies at the intersection of resource management, spatial planning, infrastructure, transportation, that really kind of neatly resolves in some way in campgrounds. And so I was trained as an architect. I became interested in landscape largely through art, actually, and sort of really moved my own career from teaching architecture to teaching in landscape architecture. And that's not really related to camping or my research, but at the same time kind of parallels that transformation in my own career.
Well, so I think in setting up the context for this book, it helps to maybe get at this question. When was it that camping turned into like a deliberate act and not just something that people did when they had no better options to sleep for the night?
Yeah. I mean, I think the kind of birth of leisure camping or recreational camping is really one that we associate with the 19th century, with the Adirondacks, and but generally with a fair amount of wealth. Individuals would come from New York City, Boston, would hire local guides and head out in the woods, often for several weeks at a time. I think it gains in importance with the opening of the national parks. 1916, the kind of motor vehicle makes cross-country travel much more available. And as that, really, I would think that the 1920s is that decade where it scales up in a significant way. But at the same time, I think a lot of camping at that point is more going from one town to another, settling at a local campground for the night. It's not really a destination experience. But, of course, nowadays we have this unbelievable popularity of the practice has only gained, I think, in the last few decades.
Well, and then maybe I guess the obvious question is whether that shift to camping as a leisure activity is the catalyst that leads to the creation of camping stuff, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think gear is a really interesting. I mean, I've become really interested in sort of camping gear over the development of this book, and some of the early gear catalogs or gear companies like Abercrombie and Fitch are often more related to hunting. There'd be a few pages with selling tents, sleeping bags, and the like, but I think a lot of it was often more hunting gear related, and of course those kinds of split up eventually, and the specialization of that gear is something that happens a little bit later on. But pre-war, World War II, but I think post-war, there's a big explosion of these camping gear companies like the North Face and so on. Like all of that really happens in the 60s and the 70s.
It's funny or maybe quaint or just maybe delicious to think of the time when Abercrombie and Fitch was really an outdoors hunting supply company and not just another storefront in a mall someplace.
Yeah, no, I think the arc of Abercrombie is extremely interesting in itself. I think that could be quite. But yeah, I was able to get my hands on some of those early catalogs, which are quite interesting.
In fact, I think as we're having this conversation, I'm remembering. I think it was on Jeopardy last night that there was a question about. It was the year that I think sometime in the '90s that Abercrombie and Fitch dropped the moose from their logo, which has nothing to do with your book. But so, what were the first vestiges of camping specific stuff?
For me, the campfire is often the kind of, I mean, we think of it as the kind of geographical center of the campsite, but I think there's a bit of infrastructure that develops around the campfire itself to develop a kind of permanent place. And I think the entire camp starts to revolve around the presence of the campfire. Even though we light a fire, we put it out, we go back and forth, it is the kind of single, often center. It's the functional center. It's where we cook meat. It's where we stay warm. It's where we congregate, where we socialize. So in my mind, that is often the kind of single element. And I think when you arrive at a campsite nowadays with the fire pit, I mean, it's a descendant of that early campfire circle, like the kind of rings, what we think about with the stones ringing the kind of area.
It's the convener.
Yeah.
I think the thing that might be the most surprising to me in reading through this book, though it also is the thing that maybe shouldn't have been surprising at all, and maybe I just never thought of it before, was the idea that everything about the design of campgrounds was a deliberate choice, from the way the signs and picnic tables and the fire pit looks, to the way the bathroom is built, to the way that campgrounds are laid out. It's interesting to think of a time that it actually someone had to, or some group of people had to decide this is the camping aesthetic.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the motor vehicle is really what drives, pun intended, what drives the development of that kind of scale of campground, where it's no longer a group of individuals headed out establishing a kind of site at their own, on their own, but rather a large group of people that are convening upon an area. And I think the early campgrounds developed by the National Park Service, when you see them in photographs in the 1910s, are no more than just big open fields, and people could set up wherever they like. But you see a lot of motor vehicles in those fields. I think it becomes necessary at some point to structure the movement of vehicles around those areas. And that's what leads to individual parking spots, individual campsites, all of that, in my mind, really comes from the accommodation of the motor vehicle in those wilder settings.
Yeah, I think for people who are used to driving into the campground and getting that campground map and finding their spot and, sort of parking in a way that you can both have access to the stuff you need to get out,
Correct.
but also have the car feel like it's tucked out of the way a little bit. You'd be really surprised to look. I mean, there's a picture on the back of your book, but there are also some much earlier pictures where there are just fields full of cars and trailers and tents.
One of my favorite quotes is of this particular period in the 1910s. Someone observed in Yosemite that on the morning any one car was leaving the campground, that it was likely to haul with it a bunch of tents that had been tied to it at the same time. So using cars as sort of ways to immobilize and to stabilize tents. I thought that was such a nice illustration of that, with the kind of chaotic way in which people probably occupy those settings at that time. There were no individual sites, and you go to campsite number 7. It was just, if there's an open spot there, just park and set up your camp.
It's kind of Woodstock, in a way. Well, but there's also another idea that you write about that kind of comes along that I think speaks to what camping became, and fairly early into the process, I would guess, and that's this idea of the presumption of rusticity that seems to both inform what people are looking for and also how the aesthetic of signs and fire pits and bathrooms and stuff comes about.
No, I think that kind of rustic language, I think, is one we associate with the national parks, the kind of painting wood brown and sort of stone. And I think that really was developed at a time that kind of aesthetic was easily exportable to infrastructure like picnic tables and fire pits and so on, bathrooms. And so it's one that's adopted by the Parks Service, and one that's, again, finds its way into the kind of spatial language or the architectural language of the campground.
And now today, it's seeing a sign or an aesthetic like that is almost shorthand for camping here.
It is, yeah.
I feel like one of the heroes of this history is someone that if you ask the vast majority of people at a campground, if you mention this name, they would never have heard of him, but he haunts this book in a lot of ways. Who was Albert Good, and why is he so important to so much of what camping has been about for the better part of a century or more?
Yeah, it's interesting you would ask that. I just a few weeks ago was able to get my hands on the first photograph that I've ever seen of Albert Good, but it's an individual I've been interested in and thinking about for a very long time. So Good is an architect, was hired, had a firm in Cleveland, and was hired by the Park Service during the Great Depression, early 1930s, to produce a compendium of survey drawings that document all this kind of the kind of architectural components that make up picnic grounds, campgrounds, all of this infrastructure in the national parks. And so it's one that he documents with these beautiful drawings absolutely gorgeous drawings. I mean, as an architect, for me, those are just absolutely so beautifully executed. But what's really interesting about it is as he documents this under contract from the Park Service, this book, Park and Recreation Structures, which is published by the Park Service in the 1930s, becomes in a way the kind of reference volume for all state parks and across the country. So it's one that not only documents what's going on in the national parks, but it's a book that in a way helps to explain the kind of development of other campgrounds, other facilities later on as well. So it's one that really it's the base. It's the first kind of textbook of that kind of architecture.
Do we know why they chose Albert Good of all people?
I do not know a lot about that, but I think that's a great question. Good, from all appearance, had a successful practice in Cleveland, and is seen a photograph that his photograph by the Park Service, very formally dressed in a suit and tie. So I've never seen a photograph of him in the field, but I would imagine a lot of the work was to be in the field at various campgrounds and parks across the country, documenting carefully, measuring all of these facilities. And so, but I've never seen him in action. And it's, but when you see the photograph, it's one that doesn't necessarily resolve well with an image of a kind of outdoor-minded individual, right, who would take pleasure in sort of doing that.
He doesn't affect the Teddy Roosevelt look.
No, he did not.
But it's interesting to think about because he was, I'm sure there was some work done in this area before that, but he's kind of creating so much of this out of whole cloth.
Yeah, there was very few books that I was able to find before that Good. In fact, the first edition of the book proved so popular that it was expanded into a 2-volume set, and it's fairly easy to find a reprint of that 2-book set nowadays. But there were a couple of other similar volumes maybe in the late 1910s, early 20s. But I think Good is the one reference that I think many scholars will go back to.
Yeah.
Again, not the first, but certainly the most comprehensive and the most impactful. For me, as an architect, for a long time, I was wondering, like, how do architects get interested in camping? And coming across Good and realizing he was an architect really validated some of my own intuitions about my own interest in this field. So, there's a justification there.
Like you should have a picture of the picture of Albert Good framed behind your desk.
Well, the photograph is high res, so it was great. I mean, again, after years to actually see him in a photograph was a very moving moment. Like it was great.
Oh, wow. Well, and we've been talking sort of around what his contribution was, but say you're a modern day 21st century camper and you've secured a spot at a campground in the Adirondack Park or Shenandoah National Park, right, or what have you. As you look around your campsite and as you look around the campground, what are the things that Albert Good contributed to that are still present as you're camping here in the first half of the 21st century?
I mean, I think the one individual I would think would be even more influential in his own way would be Emilio Meineke, who is the individual who really formulated the kind of spatial guidelines of roads and how these one-way roads and these individual campsites. So that kind of infrastructure, I think, is absolutely connected to Meineke. I think Albert Good, certainly the kind of architectural character of the infrastructure is one that I think we really connect him to. But for me, when looking at that book, he has very specific chapters on each one of those components. The picnic table has, for example, an entire chapter, and I think it's very interesting that he sought to establish the general typologies that exist of all that kind of equipment, the stuff that is in place that greets us when we arrive. And it's restrooms. I mean, there's a significant amount.
Water fountains,
yeah.
Even, yeah.
There's a significant amount of stuff that I think one doesn't really pay attention to until a book like this one helps you to realize that all of that stuff is extremely intentionally designed, situated, and for me, that was kind of a revelation.
I think one of the things that might surprise people about this book is you do a fair amount of writing about corporate camping, if you will, the KOA phenomenon, and you write very even-handedly, even positively about where KOA fits into the history of camping and the camping aesthetic.
Yeah, for me, my first campground experience was at a KOA, and so it's one that I've often associated that specific interest. They were very generous to allow me into their archives and being able to review the material that they had available. I think what's really noticeable to me about KOAs is the idea that in, I think, 1962, they began really with one facility, and by the 1970s, the end of the 70s, there were something like 800 KOAs across the country, and that number has actually expanded and shrunk at the same time. But it's one that to me is a remarkable idea, and one that we also, the idea that a facility like that could be private, it could be privatized, and certainly monetized. That experience could be monetized. For me, I found very interesting as well.
And also the marriage of camping with miniature golf.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at KOA, I think the proliferation of services and comforts at a KOA are often cross the line into this isn't camping anymore. But what I'm always been really interested in is finding that line. And I think KOA have really have thought of themselves largely as innovators, but I often really push the envelope. But they're phone reservations, camping directories, all of that stuff, it really happens with KOAs, and these practices have been adopted elsewhere later on. But they've also had some efforts that have been a little bit less successful, but I think I really enjoy the kind of broad thinking that they brought to the experience.
We talked a little about photography, mainly the photo of Albert Good, but I wanted to ask you a little about Bruce Davidson, whose photos of campers at Yosemite show up in many places throughout this book. They don't paint a very glamorous image of 1960s Yosemite. What was the point Davidson was trying to make by taking this series of photos that he did?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to me those photographs are really important. I would say Albert Good and Davidson's are my two kind of central references in setting up this book. I think the photographs he took of Yosemite campers, I think there were maybe 12 or 13. It's part of a much larger body of work, but it's the only time in his career that he focused on campers. I think he was maybe trying to showcase the kind of unglamorous nature of that experience. But when you look at these photographs, it's also very interesting to me that you cannot identify Yosemite as a place. Like, it could be anywhere. And I think maybe there's a commentary there about place, that the settings themselves have become by that point fairly generic and recognizable, and that they could be anywhere. For me, when I saw those photographs for the first time, was the moment where I identified someone who was thinking in a similar way that I was about, or that I aspired to, about this work. And so that was also extremely important.
It is interesting, I think, to think about the inception of so many of these objects. I was reading through this about the evolution of the tent over the years, for example. What objects do you think have changed the most, and maybe what objects have changed the least over time?
Yeah. I mean, I was really surprised to learn that sleeping bags are really an invention that is fairly recent, 150 years or so. I would say that the tent technologically has really evolved in extremely interesting ways. I think certainly all technologies around fire and cooking have become also much more specialized in terms of fuel, in terms of the ability to kind of get a cooking flame within a few seconds at the push of a button.
We're not roasting the hot dogs over the flame anymore.
Or when I think about some of these early camping how-to books from the 1910s and 20s, or even late 19th century, the amount of often several chapters would be dedicated to the art of building a campfire from scratch. This idea now that you can press on a button and be able to get at
There's an entertaining picture of you with a campfire, and I suspect you were not the flint and stone type.
No, but I mean, I think or that you could buy wood in a box,
right.
Which is so. I think I would say those are the ones that I try to spend a little bit more time on. But I would think that the tent and the campfire or fire in general, would be some of the technologies that have evolved the most. I've become recently interested in also food as a kind of potentially as a, maybe it's not in the book, but as a future chapter, as a future article, like the dehydration of food, all this kind of packaging where it becomes its own form of gear. And any gear store now has several aisles dedicated to these highly specialized foods where all you need to do is add water and you have this pretty delicious meal. So
here's this vacuum-sealed beef bourguignon.
That could stay on a shelf, right, for months or years at a time. So I think that's really interesting and one that I would be intrigued to pursue further.
Why was the Nalgene bottle such a breakthrough when it came along in 1949?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's great about the Nalgene bottle, too, is that it's a regional claim to fame. I did not know that, but it was, a company founded in Rochester, New York, which is great, but really as a kind of labware company, cheap labware. But I think at the beginning of the 1970s, those bottles, outdoor enthusiasts realized that those bottles could be, in a way, repurposed towards and brought into the outdoors. And of course, as we know now, there are so many different variations of Nalgene bottles, and it's the type of artifact that, again, it's become so ubiquitous. It's no longer associated strictly with outdoor recreation. Most of my students have an Nalgene bottle, and when you walk around a campground, so it has become a kind of such an iconic object.
I could imagine some of your students reading this book and saying, they invented it in 1949. What did people put stickers on before that?
Yeah, and I think when you look at often RVs and campgrounds will have on the backside of the RV all the stickers of the parks where they camp. Well, the Nalgene bottle is the kind of low-rent version of that same experience, right? You kind of plaster all these stickers such that you can't even see inside of the bottle anymore.
Right. It's interesting to think about what you've compiled here in the context of some of the guidebooks that you write about. How would you envision people using this book?
In my mind, what I envision, I think when we designed the book, the physical artifact, I want it to be fairly small, so it could fit in your backpack and you could be brought into at the campsite. And they're really not a book that's meant to be a coffee table book that you only keep at home, but something whose size and weight invites it being packed along with the rest of your gear. I envision in my own mind like people at the picnic table in the evening or at the campfire reading a chapter once in a while. Like it has a kind of the length of the chapters, not so long that it could be digested within an hour. And then so that's what it felt like that would be to understand those settings by reading about them in that place where the experience itself is taking place. That was my goal. That was the hope.
I guess if worse comes to worse, it's probably flammable, too.
Yeah, I thought about that, too.
So I gather if you were to find Albert Good's original work, there are echoes of it in how you constructed this book.
Yeah, I think the Park and Recreation Structures is really set up in a extremely each chapter is focused on a single piece of infrastructure. There's a chapter, for example, on fire pits. There's a chapter on picnic tables and the like. And I think in fashioning this book, I was really interested in replicating that structure. So in this book, there are 8 chapters, each one dealing with one of those. What we think about are the kind of foundational components of the campsite. So there's the campsite, the picnic table, the fire pit, the tent, the sleeping bag, systems for disposing of trash, systems for delivering water, and of course one that I'm interested in too is the map as a kind of artifact. So I wanted to honor Good in a way by using way to organize all of this knowledge into these extremely clear chapters that echo the structure of his book.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to think of the someone who's designing a campground now is using so many of Good's ideas, possibly without having any idea that they're Good's ideas.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say Good for the kind of architectural elements, and Meineke for the kind of spatial planning. And it's really interesting that the Meineke, this single article, it's 8 pages, is the absolute blueprint for all spatial layouts of all motor vehicle center campgrounds around all go back to the rules and kind of spatial patterns that he set in motion there. So the impact of this single article are pretty extraordinary.
The Meineke Big Bang, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's really just interesting stuff. Martin Hogue, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Martin Hogue lives in Syracuse and is a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture at Cornell University. His recent book is called Making Camp, A Visual History of Camping's Most Essential Items and Activities. There is a link to more about it and more about him at ncpr.org/northwards. Now here is Ethan Shancy with a list of our most essential staff members, the people who put this podcast together.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.